One of the major aspects of chapter 19, as it says the 18th century, is we're going to start seeing a change in the attitudes and the views. This is going to be an era that will actually go from the 1700s all the way into the end of the 1790s, technically the 1800s. Some of the aspects here are going to go into really the early 19th century. We're going to see a change in a number of areas. We're going to see a change from a very conservative, exploratory nature of the different countries to a rising dissatisfaction with the system. And you're going to start seeing an age of revolution. As it talks here about Jacques-Louis David, his self-portrait, he becomes the official artist of the French Empire court under Napoleon. He actually is before Napoleon, during the time of Napoleon, and after Napoleon. And it's one of those interesting aspects that he's able to do so well. As it says here, he sketched Marie Antoinette as she was led off to execution. And so, as such, he was able to be in part of every aspect from the time of the French kings, the royals, through the time of the deposing of those French royals, Marie Antoinette, for instance, and then into the rise of Napoleon. And he was able to stay in favor of all those. As it says here, he had been a revolutionary, a regicide, and a Bonapartist. He was, after the fall of Napoleon, he wound up being part of the new royal court, Louis XVIII. And so he's able to be part of this, and as such, his paintings will capture a number of the different aspects in this very changing time, where you're going to have rise of science, you're going to have a rise in art, you're going to have a rise in architecture, you're going to have changes, development in literature. As it says here, this was an era of revolution. You have changes across Europe, not just in France, where you do have the French Revolution in 1789, but you also have revolutions elsewhere. You have wars being fought across Europe. The Napoleonic Wars involve almost all of Europe and actually move into other areas as well. But you also have wars fought in a number of places. Frederick of Prussia winds up fighting a number of wars during his reign. You have, of course, in 1776 to 1783, you have the American Revolution. So you have a number of these changes that are taking place. And much of it has to do with the attitudes and philosophies that are going to impact how people think and regard what is the right way for man to be. Painting and art and music, for instance, takes on this aspect. It mentions Mozart here and his satiric details as he writes. And you have the rise of, at the end of the 17th century and into the early 18th century, you have the rise of a style of literature called a comedy of manners. And it talks about Hogarth. His paintings are reflecting that attitude where fun is being made of the way that people are and the way that society has been structured. This shows you about the different rulers and what happens. We get, after the death of Elizabeth I, as we've covered before, you have James I come in. Then he's succeeded by Charles I, who gets involved in a civil war in England and is beheaded. And you have the English Commonwealth period under Oliver Cromwell. Then in 1660 you have the restoration of the monarchy in England with Charles II, the son of Charles I. When he dies, his brother James II takes over, but basically no one likes him. And there's a change there that takes place. Parliament, which basically runs the government, that was the deal that they made when they brought back Charles II, was opposed by James II, who was trying to be more of the monarch of Europe, if you will, the way they had been done with absolute control. And Parliament and James II clashed, so much so that Parliament opted to bring in a new monarch. They approached his daughter, Mary, who had not gone along with her father. She actually had married to displease him. She married a Protestant. James II was much more Catholic in his views. but she had married a Protestant in the Netherlands, the Duke of Orange, named William, and they were approached about becoming the monarch, or she was approached about becoming the monarch of England. She says she would if she could bring her husband as a co-monarch, and the English Parliament agreed. So William and Mary set out, preparing for a civil war, but when they arrived in England, James II had fled, taking his wife and his newborn son to France, and they would stay there for quite some time, which becomes an interesting complication because Mary and William take over. Mary dies. William reigns for a while. When he dies, Mary's sister Anne is made the monarch, and when she dies without an heir, the line should have gone back to the Stuarts, or stayed with the Stuarts, should have gone to the descendants of James II. By this time he had a grandson, who should have been the king. But rather than have the Stuart line be maintained, Parliament opted to go find someone else. And just as they'd chosen the Stuarts by looking at a branch of the family tree of Elizabeth I, they looked at a different branch, not nearly as close, and chose a German named George of Hanover, and he becomes George I of England, and is succeeded by George II, and then George III, and it just keeps on going. Well, George III is the one that we probably know better as the King of England during the American Revolution. We'll cover more about him as we go through this chapter. The arts become really important. This is called Rococo style, where you go from the Baroque into the Rococo, where it's emphasizing more color, more elaboration than even the Baroque had done, and you have the style that develops that becomes really an impressive style when we look at the Rococo. As it says here, that this style is derived from the Rocaille that had been part of the Baroque aspect. It was conceived of as an anti-Baroque, supposed to be, as it says here, civilized and light-hearted in its approach between writing and the music, the dancing, etc. It had as it says, a grace, but it becomes very elaborate in what it's going to do. So much so that it becomes really, as it says here with the painting, you're going to have embellishment with scrolls and ribbons and gilt. All this is part of it. Some of the paintings of this era by Watteau, for instance, and you can see this one here. The elaborate details, this countryside, this pastoral setting. You can see just how extended it is. And the use of this is going to influence later generations of painters also. As it says here, this is an idyllic setting, and the Rococo starts focusing on this idea of idealism as part of what will eventually become known as the Romantic era, and that's part of this era as well. As we move through, we have Fragonard. This is a painting some of you may be familiar with. It's called The Swing, and this is one of the details of the swing. You have a young girl, of course, on a swing, and you have the gentleman here who is pushing her, in that swing. But what you may not recognize is that she, of course, is enjoying the swing as she's doing so. But over here, unbeknownst to this gentleman, is another man who is busily looking up, and you can see that as she flips off her shoe, he has a view. And so this is part of that Rococo period. There's a lighthearted aspect, a sense of whimsy, a little bit of the risque aspect to it. And the reason you may know this particular painting, if you go and look at the article that I have for you and we're going to look at that very quickly, the module. It's an article over the art of Disney in movies, and bear with me just a moment, this is calling up. It takes a little while. But this particular painting, The Swing, if you've ever seen Frozen, and I'm going to assume that many of you have, you're going to recognize that painting here from, and still trying to call that up, I'll have to come back to it in a moment. That this is a painting that actually, if you remember the scene where Anna is going through the art gallery that's there in their palace in Frozen, and you have a number of these And again, it's frozen here. Bear with me. It's sort of appropriate. I'm trying to show you this. And this freezes. Well, anyway, there are a number. You can go look at the archive about the art of Disney, and you'll see that a number of paintings that appear in the movies are actually based upon actual artwork, and the swing is one. It's a more sanitized version. There is no individual looking up the girl's dress. It's something that's a little different. It's this here, not so innocent maiden is being swung by a chaperone, while her reclining gentleman friend is delighted with the view, as they want to call it. And this is Fragonard, and he painted a number of these artworks that are really very useful landscape, but usually has this one little side touch to it that's going to be a little risque. It says that he was reduced to poverty eventually, and he eventually died, as it says, in obscurity. And Fragonard is one of those interesting painters. Really strong painter, really good. Meanwhile, you have Rosalba Carriera, who was born in Venice and moved to Paris, and she is a painter, and this is Louis XV as a boy. She really was able, and she, as it says here, was unparalleled in technique of colored chalk. She was traveled throughout Europe. She painted portraits in a number of areas of the royalty throughout Europe, and others, patrons including wealthy middle class and nobles. And so she had a great deal of talent, Carrera did. Tiepolo is another one. This is giving you an idea. This is how you have the painting again on this grand scale. See the gilding here, the sense of the details, the twists and furls, and this is Rococo, and Tiepolo is an individual who was again coming out of different areas, painted in palaces. This was one from, as it says, the family of Italian merchants, and this is what this is. This is something that we have previously seen painted upon the ceilings, of course, of chapels. Well, this is in a private home. This is part of what marks this Rococo era. Meanwhile, the architecture also begins developing and building, again using this elaborate style that is part of it. This gives you an idea of the church that's in Germany. And you can see this elaborate decoration that goes on, and how the gilding and the use of the gold coloring and the painting and the images is part of this era. It's really a remarkable architectural achievement. And again, you can see here the altar area and the detailing here and the sense of the displays that are all part of this Rococo architecture. It gets even, this is in part of it by Balthasar Neumann. As it says here, gracious curves and elaborate details where you have a decoration of the interior. That's part of it. Neumann is one of those really interesting figures. This era of the 18th century is also called the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment. It also has a few other names, but it is an era where, again, a focus starts being placed by writers and scientists and others, philosophers. Excuse me, we got things that are popping up. I'm trying to get this to give me a quit doing the error message. Finally, this era it becomes part of what we see as a very elaborate aspect where people start really questioning and trying to figure out what the world is about. You have Adam Smith writing about economics with the Wealth of Nations, the idea of let it be, laissez-faire, which is still practiced today. As he says, Adam Smith is often called the father of capitalism. But you have science also being developed during this time. Part of what we have is this age of reason, is individuals start trying to determine natural causes, and what is now called natural philosophy, or what was then called natural philosophy, is now what we would call science. Meanwhile, in France, which becomes a hub for painting, You have a number of individuals. Again, the royal family is part of it. Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun paints Marie Antoinette and the children, again offering a view here. And it says here the painter, she left France and traveled. She lived to be 87, painted some 800 works. And again, she is trying to show people as they are. She doesn't try to make it very much more elaborate, but that's part of what she does. So Vigée Lebrun is an interesting one. Meanwhile, Gainsborough in England is doing similar. This is one of his paintings of a noble in England. And although they're portraits, quite often he will use a background of nature. And they're not necessarily posing here. He would paint the background and then put the figure in it. It says a deep, lush landscape, the large figure in the surroundings, and this is Countess Howe of what we have here. You have Joshua Reynolds also painting, quite often of military personnel, as it says here, to sort of commemorate their heroics. He also painted in a number of other areas. He painted famous writers, Samuel Johnson, James Baldwin. Hogarth comes along, and he paints in a more lighthearted manner. This is from Marriage a la Mode, which was actually a name of a play from an earlier era, and he used that as a basis of his paintings. And again, you can see that this one is a little more lighthearted. You can see the chair spilled over, everything here. That these are people who are, as it says here, in a sort of exhausted series of events. Yeah, so again, you have this aspect here. He, of course, in case you didn't recognize this earlier, these are all bills, where this elaborate entertainment that they must have had is proving quite costly. And so Hogarth certainly injects painting art with a humorous aspect, of a lightheartedness that we don't always see. Meanwhile, you have Copley. This is of Paul Revere, a very famous painting of his. Who, again, portrait and trying to pose him in sort of a natural aspect where you have a very, as it says here, linear style, the use of lighting. This almost takes us back to Caravaggio, the use of the light and dark here. But this gives us an accurate image of what we see. We don't have the camera, but we do have the paintings here that help us to recognize individuals. This is also called the Neoclassic Age, where again they go back to the styles and the teachings and the attitudes and philosophies of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. It's during this time that they start excavating Pompeii, for instance, Herculaneum as well, that had been covered up by the explosion of Mount Vesuvius. So they started publishing what was being found eventually, and they started being drawn to what had happened in Rome and Greece in ancient times, and this develops a whole new style. Gives the subject matter. For instance, this is again David, the Oath of Horatia. You can see that this is about brothers who were defending Rome, and so you have the image here of the three brothers taking the swords from their father, their family members who are not happy about the almost certain death of their brothers that their family members will have. Meanwhile, David captures other areas, and you have other people creating art. This is Angelica Kauffman. If you'll notice, we've had several women named, and women have started getting more and more into painting as a career. Again, Kauffman is one of those. You have sculpture taking place. Again, throwback to the ancient style in Greece and Rome. And this is where they actually used an actual figure, where you have the young woman being presented as Venus. So it's Pauline Bonaparte Borghese. And so you have Canova sculpting this. Meanwhile, you also have David capturing images such as this of Napoleon. Well, the interesting aspect is that when you look at this painting, Napoleon seems almost too large for the horse. The idea of creating Napoleon as this larger-than-life figure becomes part of what David does, because this is what Napoleon wanted. It says he would fudge accurate historical detail to reframe it. So you have this detail here, commanding his troops. His eyes meet ours, as it says. And so again, it's done in a different way, where we have these figures who are become larger than life, and this is what Napoleon wants. Meanwhile, you have David also painting other works, and he creates a number of different images to help create that aspect of Napoleon. Architecture comes along, also imitating the classic style. In neoclassic, you have in Paris the building of the Pantheon. Again, it is built in the Roman format. You can see the dome here, and the Greek aspect with the lintel and the columns. So you have this neoclassic style. As it says here, it has the Greek cross plan. You have the some flying buttresses to help support it. All of this is built in this way so that it is mimicking that neoclassic. It's creating that neoclassic style, mimicking the styles architecture we saw with the Greek and Romans. This is the interior of it. You can see here the use of the dome, the use of the pillars, the use of the statues, something that was very, very typical, as we know it in Rome and in Greece. Moving through, what we also have is that this style is utilized in America. This is Thomas Jefferson's home Monticello, which he designed, and you can see that it is a neoclassic style, where you have, again, if you just look at this, there's the doming aspect, you have the lintel, the columns, and this becomes part. Now, he does not use the archways over the windows. It's one style that he deviates from, but he does maintain that arch in these windows here. And so you have this style being developed in the Americas as well. And America is a country that's actually built on neoclassic principles, as well as the following movement of Romanticism, which are a combination of both. So you have Jefferson, who studies the neoclassic style and develops architectural style. And in Charlottesville, he establishes the University of Virginia and designs many of the buildings there. And if you ever have a chance to go there, many of the buildings are very similar to Monticello in appearance. Moving through, let's move on to the next one. Music then takes a change, and what we start seeing is what we now call the classical style. The idea here is that it is music that we sometimes get a little, when we talk about classical music, everybody thinks of that formal style, but this is actually an era where what we have here, it is simply music that is a musical style from the second half, 1760s on, 50s on, as opposed to the Baroque style, and what will also follow is called Romantic. And so we have classical style, where it has a certain pattern, a balance, a clarity that is presented in the music. The Romantic is going to get a little more lush in its sound and changes in tempo, whereas the classic will try to maintain a more balanced aspect in it. We wind up with the symphony being developed during this time, which has a series of movements where you have different rhythms and presentations of themes, if you will, at different places in different ways. This developed the idea of the orchestra, so that the orchestra winds up having certain kinds of instruments, and they are going to be presented in certain ways. And this is still maintained today, where you're going to have the groupings. If you ever go to some sort of symphony, you're going to see that the arrangements are always the violins to one side, the French horns, the trumpets, trombones toward the back, and it's still maintained in this way for a number of these. And so you start having brass instruments developed, you have string instruments, you have woodwinds all being part of it, and then eventually the timpani also added as well. And so you have the development of these orchestra structuring so that music can be played. One of the developments is the sonata, which is a work that is designed, as it says here, for one or two instruments, not the full orchestra. So you're going to have piano sonata, violin sonata, etc. And it's played in a number of different ways, but part of it, there's going to be an allegro form where a little fast aspect, then it will slow down, the tempo will vary, and so you wind up having this developed style, the sonata. Haydn is one of those who develops probably the classical music style as well as any. He was supported by a patron, Prince Esterhazy, and he, as it says here, he attained a high social position based upon his music alone, his fame, and he wrote a number of symphonies. He eventually moves from Vienna to England, and during that time, it says here, he wrote more than 100 symphonies, and the last 12 are called the London Symphonies because of where he was living at the time. Also developed during this time is Mozart. In the late 18th century, you have Mozart, who, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who had poor health and dies at a fairly early age, and I think it tells you a little bit about that. But as it says here, he was a child prodigy. By the age of 6, he could play the violin, the piano, and already started composing. He had poor health, was also a little bit of a, well, they use the word temperamental here. He had a very strong view of what he was and what he could be. It says he died at age 35, basically as a pauper. He had made beautiful music and had sold it and been supported, but eventually he had wasted in a number of areas. Mozart's music is one, as it says here, wonderfully slow movement at times, and then there's going to be this play as he hits notes, and it's just he's just a the genius of Mozart is really impressive when you listen to his work. His last 3 symphonies, 39, 40, 41, he composed without any commission. That's why, since he was not being paid to do those, and expenses were major for him as he was ill, he wound up dying in poverty. But these symphonies, there's a darker side, a lighter side. This just, as it says here, is stirred and forceful and wistful at the same time. It says there's no real parallel for Mozart's symphony and what he does. He does just write music that is powerful and strong. He also wrote operas as well as symphonies. The Magic Flute, Marriage of Figaro. Bear with me, we're getting this message again, popping up. And I'm not sure why. It's something about the images in the book that's popping up for this one. But the opera is just Marriage of Figaro, as it says here, does capture the spirit of this time. This idea of emotions and views, and it's about, as it says here, Mozart's presentation about what human nature really involves. Literature develops, and this is a great age for literature. Satire develops with Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope, looking at the world and seeing it as a little darker. You have works of philosophy being written by individuals as diverse as Diderot and Rousseau. You're going to have the works of John Locke are being written earlier and then move into this era. You have Fontaine, who writes fairy tales and fables. Meanwhile, you have poetry taking place. Alexander Pope is an English author who becomes the first major author to actually support himself without a patron. He did so by doing a translation of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey into English, with a maintenance of rhyme and rhythm, just a beautifully written piece, and he sold it, was able to support himself from that, and became just the prominent writer of his era, along with Jonathan Swift. These are what we also call the Age of Augustus, because they're going back to the time of Rome under Caesar Augustus and the great glories there. So you have John Dryden, who starts in the late 17th century and writes and becomes really the first poet laureate of England prior to his death. And they did a number of translations of the works of Virgil and the other Roman poets and Greek poetry that they could find. They also did that. And he helped to inspire this idea of taking those subjects and treating it in a way of a serious at times, but also writing others that are going to be a mocking, a satiric aspect. So satire becomes a key aspect in this style of literature. And we have Alexander Pope, as says here, the greatest English poet, where you have his wit, and he's the second most quoted person behind Shakespeare. He wrote a number of different areas. He did addition here. He won economic independence, as I said earlier, by his translation of Homer. One of the major aspects about Pope is that he was a Catholic living in England, and Catholicism had been at one time outlawed, but had been allowed, but there were high restrictions on Catholics. They couldn't hold government jobs. They could not participate in government-led schools, for instance, which will lead to the development of the Montessori schools that the Catholics did to educate the young children. Since he was also forbidden to own property. Now, if they already had property in the family, they could. They just could not go out and buy new ones. And the result was that what he did, he had a house on the river by an area called Twickenham. He could not own the house. Said all he could do was rent it. So he rented it for 99 years with an option. And he this was also on a toll road, so he actually had a grotto built under the house and a tunnel underneath the road, underneath it, so that he could go up and go to his garden, which was on the other side of the road from his house. His grotto is still a place that people go. They can tour Twickenham and go into the grotto and see that one. He was able to make enough money that he was able to do so and support himself in that way in a time when Catholics were radically struggling. So Pope is just an outstanding writer, just a beautiful series of literature they wrote. Now, Jonathan Swift, his good friend, was a little more darker in his views. His satires take on a much darker edge. Gulliver's Travels, for which he's best known, is not a lighthearted children's book, but is a satire about society. The first book, Voyage to Lilliput, he's actually making fun of politics and religion. In the second book, he's making fun of the English attitude about itself being such a great country, where instead of being the giant among the little people in Lilliput, Gulliver finds himself a little person among giants in Brobdingnagia. And at one time, he is put on display before the king of the Brobdingnagians. And Gulliver brags about how great England is and where he's from and how they have great cannon that can destroy people. And it horrifies the king because the Brobdingnagians do not have war. And he cannot understand it. You kill each other, you kill fellow men. And so Swift is making fun of the series of wars and politics of his generation. The third book in the Gulliver's Travel makes fun of science and philosophy, and how their heads are always up in the clouds. And the last book, called The Land of the Winhams, Swift is much darker. By that time, he was really a cynic about the world. He makes a As it says here, his savage indignation, it becomes a bitter satire. And he really does at that time. And so you have satirists, Pope and Swift, among others, who are offering their views about how the world is and how it fails to appreciate. Although there's so much going on, they felt that the world fails to appreciate the good qualities. You also have Robbie Burns writing in a much more natural pre-romantic era and style. Mary Wollstonecraft, who will be the mother of Mary Shelley. Mary Wollstonecraft is a figure of the Enlightenment where she really pushes for feminine rights. And as you see here, she wrote a very well-known commentary called Vindication of the Rights of Women, in which she talks about how women are just as capable as men. And you have a satiric aspect here. As it says here, the neglected education of my fellow creatures is a grand source of misery I deplore. That women need to acquire strength both of mind and body, that they are capable of doing so, and that they, unfortunately, society, she goes on and says, stops them from becoming all that they should be. Diderot comes along and starts writing and prepares an encyclopedia. It is the first of the encyclopedias, which essentially just meant he was trying to write down every bit of information about every subject possible. Hence why it was called an encyclopedia. It was to write about everything. And it was the first attempt. He doesn't shortchange or try to censor any of the details, including politics and religion, so that the encyclopedia was banned eventually, and it had to be published secretly. This leads to eventually the development of the Britannica, the Encyclopedia Britannica in England, and it starts being worked on as well. Part of what they write about here is about humanism. The idea, again, going back to that classic idea that had been developed and that had been fostered in the early Renaissance with Pico about humanism and the possibility of man achieving greatness. Well, this becomes part of it. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau comes along and writes about the social contract. John Locke earlier had written about this. And Rousseau looks at it and says that we enter into these organizations of people, of societies, with the idea of we give up certain rights in order to gain certain privileges, and that we do so because we know we will gain. And if one side or the other breaks the contract, then it is perfectly allowable for the wrong side to leave the contract. And this is part of what he talks about, his noble savage. Man is a noble savage. He's capable of good. And you can see this excerpt here from the social contract. This is going to give a large influence on Thomas Jefferson when he's writing the Declaration of Independence. It's going to influence what will be written in the United States Constitution. The works of Rousseau and the earlier writings of John Locke are going to influence that. Meanwhile, you have Voltaire writing Candide, which is a satire, where he's making fun of religion and politics and just a little bit of everything in that book. And it tells you a little bit about Voltaire. He attacks just about everything in the world, everything is best for the best of all possible worlds. That's become sort of this telling remark that he uses in Candide, where he's ridiculing Leibniz, that he has that's all best, everything is happening. Dr. Pangloss, as it says here, the tutor, tells Candide that all is best for the best in this best of all possible worlds. Candide buys into it and tries to always see how, despite everything that happens, all the terrible things that occur, including the earthquake in Lisbon that is described, that destroyed most of Lisbon in 1755, and it's described in this novel. Candide is always trying to find that positive somewhere, despite the fact that he gets beaten, he gets cheated, of money. Everything possibly can go wrong happens, but it's all for the best in this best of all possible worlds. And Dr. Pangloss keeps assuring him of this, and despite everything that happens to Pangloss. This leads us to this idea about revolution and what will happen. The United States in 1776, France in 1789, and you have the Declaration of Rights of Men, where the monarchy is overthrown. They're not immediately executed, but instead they try to establish a democratic government for a while, but it doesn't work very well. And eventually the monarchs and the nobles are seen as the source of all the problems, and many are executed. So many so, and others who are declared enemies of the state are executed. So much so that the executioners could no longer keep up with the number. They wore out each day. And a doctor tried to develop a more benevolent way of execution, because after about the 40th or 50th person had to have the head chopped off, the blade of the axe was not as sharp. It may take several blows to get the head totally severed. Well, this doctor came up with a device, and it becomes named after him. It's called the guillotine. So Dr. Guillotine develops using the principles of kinetic energy, potential and kinetic energy. Science is applied, and executions went much more quickly. Meanwhile, the American Revolution built upon the neoclassic principles, but also expressing some of the romantic views that are going to come along. We'll talk about those later. But we have these details here that's from the Declaration. Hopefully you're familiar with it. This leads us into some of the writers who are the romantics. And Shelley is one of those. This is the painting of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart, and it's presented here as it is sort of a figure of George Washington as a representative figure of this neoclassic aspect, what he represents. And this takes us to the end of the chapter. I'm sorry about some of the problems that did occur, the pop-up there, but this will give you an idea of what is taking place in chapter 19. And I'll be posting this to Canvas.